Hello and welcome to Business Standard. Here's a glimpse of the views expressed on the web pages of Business Standard this week. In his weekly column National Interest, Shikhar Gupta writes that Pakistan Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa's recent call for India and Pakistan to bury the hatchet and make a new beginning clearly indicates that in contrast to India, Pakistan faces a more challenging situation. It can either make peace with India or continue fighting it and become an economic colony of China. Gupta points out that in the present day and age, it's not possible to achieve anything by force. He goes on to say that peace would be in the best interest of both the countries, and the Modi government, which is in fact not looking for war, should strive for the same because it's strong enough to do so. He concludes by saying that while Nehru did not have a choice but to go down fighting in 1962, Modi is too strong to fall in that trap. In his weekly column for the Business Standard, TN9N writes that from cryptocurrency to self-driven cars, the great white hope of digitisation has acquired confusing, often dystopian dimensions that demand new rules and a different understanding of society. While he writes about a world changing at a dizzying speed, a premature arrival of the future, and issues like personal data and the collusion between media and big tech to spread post-truth, he points out that there is still a positive side to all this. He concludes by saying that whatever the future might hold, good or bad, it will be a different world. In his weekly column for the Business Standard, Mahesh Vyas says the proportion of women in the total population is less than half, but slightly more than half the fresh graduates are women. Yet, the average Indian woman is far from being an employed woman. Indian women work a lot, but their work is predominantly at home in service of other members of their household. Their participation in the labor markets outside their houses in urban India is very low in spite of their superior education. There are only 3 cases under which this can happen. Either Indian women are not willing to go out to work, or they're not allowed to go out to work, or people are not willing to give them work in spite of their education. The second and third cases reflect bias in society, and possibly they cause the first case. Indian women have education and inspiration, but not enough employment, writes Vyas. India celebrated yet another International Women's Day last week, with everyone advising everyone else on how to improve the lives of women, writes Shamal Majumdar in a column for Business Standard. The advisories read almost the same as those made last year and the years before, but they do serve a useful purpose. At least they remind us year after year of the challenges that still lie ahead. The World Economic Forum's Gender Gap report lists quite a few of them, and the findings remain deeply worrying. Of significant concern is the economic gender gap, which places India at the 149th place among 153 countries. The participation of women in the labor force is also among the lowest in the world, and a woman's earned income is only 20% of a man's. It's definitely not the case that India is alone in the misery women face. In fact, based on the current rate of progress, it will take another 100 years to achieve gender equality globally, Majumdar writes. The uproar over TV series Bombay Begums and over Tanda before that reminds us televisual content is now a political battleground, writes Veer Sanghvi in a column for Business Standard. People who have never watched shows say they're outraged by them, politicians stir up public anger, heads of governmental organizations issue threats they're incapable of delivering on, and the police and the courts get involved usually in a manner that does the institutions of democracy no credit. The system now proposed by this government talks about internet regulation, but ultimately what it institutes is a committee of babus. It won't end the chaos, but it will be much better than the dangerous anarchy that prevails today, writes Sanghvi. In a column for Business Standard, Somshekhar Sundaresan writes, the public debate over the change in policy governing perpetual bonds issued by banks underlines issues with policy choices. Perpetual debt doesn't have to be repaid by a specified date, which makes valuation a tricky job. The markets regulator has now imposed a requirement to treat the bonds as being repayable in 100 years in order to be able to compute yields and thereby value the bonds. But when managing change, it's important to remember that the medicine cannot be more painful than the ailment. A sudden and immediate imposition of a 100-year tenure would overnight lead to the very same bonds having to be repriced and revalued. The volatile change from how the market has been valuing the bonds until now to how it would be forced to value from now on would inflict deep pain, writes Sundaresan. Two things are certain to happen. from here on in West Bengal politics, writes Perpetual in a column for Business Standard. The first is that no matter who wins the elections, the BJP will remain a powerful force in Bengal and perhaps even the dominant force. The structural advantages it has in terms of resources, cadre, and support from the center are overwhelming. The second is that Bengal will go through a phase of sustained division and perhaps violence of the sort that we've not seen in another state in a long time. Love jihad, beef ban, Pakistan, religious sites, and such things have not been a part of political campaigning in Bengal, but they will be now and at scale. The genesis of the BJP was actually in the politics of West Bengal, though the party was not able to develop itself in the state until recently. The BJP is coming full circle in the state it had begun its ascent to power with, writes Patel. R. Gopalakrishnan writes in an editorial that boards tend to favor the creation and perpetuation of a homogeneous whole. Firms seek a director who will fit in. Through the existing practice, diversity becomes a casualty by gender, linguistic group, or nationality, because diversity means a person who is not like the others. While there are evolutionary and social factors, there is also a neuropsychological factor. Variation places an additional burden on the brain's neurons by demanding more resources. Although the brain resists variation, in contrast, variation is at the core of evolution and life forms. If company boards or citizens of a nation do not welcome variation, their eventual homogeneity can pose an existential threat. This can be seen through corporate experience and history, writes Gopalakrishnan. In an editorial, Business Standard writes, the concern over the market regulator SEBI's guidelines on valuing perpetual bonds, such as additional Tier 1 or AT1 securities issued by banks, has its roots in the Yes Bank crisis and the RBI's action in that case. Investors lost heavily when the bank, prompted by the RBI, wrote off AT1 bonds worth Rs 8,400 crores, thereby putting them in a higher risk category than even equities. SEBI has rightly identified a serious problem with the valuation of these complex instruments, and its suggestion will bring in more transparency to the process. The blame for the mess must go to rating agencies and mutual funds that tended to value perpetual bonds as 5-year bonds. This was a wrong practice because it gave perpetual bonds higher value than they deserved, the editorial says. SEBI is looking at paving the way for special purpose acquisition vehicles or SPACs in India, but this is a risky proposition, writes Business Standard in an editorial. SPACs are essentially shell companies floated to acquire private firms. This is often seen as a faster way for privately held companies to get listed. A reason for allowing a SPAC-like structure in India could be to encourage startups to list domestically, but there are concerns. For instance, this route is preferred by firms to sidestep regulatory scrutiny. Clearly, this will be in the best interest of neither the financial markets nor the investors. It's possible that such shell firms will be listed to acquire other companies at lofty valuations at the cost of ordinary shareholders. Besides, recent data shows that companies acquired by SPACs have underperformed the broader markets in the US, the editorial says. In an editorial, Business Standard writes that the formulation of a national e-commerce policy is a welcome move, as it will serve as a reference point for the online retail industry. But the draft policy needs further consultation before it's finalized as a rulebook for e-commerce, a tiny fraction of the $700 billion retail market. In the current form, it neither shows any sign of a stable regulatory regime nor policy predictability, both necessary for companies to do business in a competitive environment. For instance, it advocates equal treatment of all sellers and cautions platform owners against creating algorithms to prioritize select vendors. Indeed, a good and equitable policy is required for a level playing field, but that should not apply just to sellers. It must extend to marketplace platforms as well without differentiating between foreign and domestic, big and small, the editorial says.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.